Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 448 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you all had a good new year and that you're feeling refreshed going into 2023. Today I'm talking to Dr. Kelli Morgan and Jennifer Zwilling, who co-curated Figuring Space, which is an exhibition featuring 12 contemporary artists working with the figure. In this interview, we discuss the historical use of the figure to portray power both in political and religious senses, as well as the variety of sculptural approaches that are used by the featured artists. We also talk about the Clay Studio's recent move to the South Kensington neighborhood, which they did within the last year. So if you're interested in seeing the new location, this exhibition would be a great way to do that. The show opens January the 12th, and you can also attend a free symposium featuring all of the artists that are in the show. They will be on hand to talk about the ideas in their work, which is happening January the 14th on that Saturday. If you're interested in finding out more, you can go to the Clay Studio website, which is theclaystudio.org. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I'm going to start with you all introducing yourself. So Kelli, if you could start, and then also tell us where you are and where you work.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelli Morgan, professor of practice and director of curatorial studies at Tufts University, and I'm located in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And I am Jennifer Zwilling. I am the curator and director of artistic programs at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia.
We're here today to talk about Figuring Space, which is an exhibition that's going to come up. I think it opens January the 12th.
Yes.
But I wanted to start more broadly and just talk about figure sculpture in the past, like how it is used and what it's been for. In your essay, you all talked about how it was used as a show of imperial power. And so if either of you could explain that.
For the longest time, right, the human body, was always a discursive site, for several, oppressive or discriminatory, social culture, or social parameters, socio-political parameters. And what's interesting about the figure, particularly in terms of art history, is that as, art museums and art history anthropology developed this discipline, and developed this human taxonomy, from, Black, brown, uncivilized, primitive, savage, right, to white, male, human citizen. That white, male, human citizen was based on, Greek classical sculpture, what the white male body looks like, in Greek classical sculpture, not actually, a real white male human body. And that was fascinating to me, as I studied art history, as I've, moved through my curatorial career, because it really became the standard, right, that everybody else, was juxtaposed or kind of understood, and defined against. But at the same time being like a fictive representation, right? That like really and truly no real human being, right, could ever meet. And that really shifted something for me, in how I approach, American art, and how I approach sculpture, how I approach, I think, my own positionality in a space as a Black woman and as a curator. And so when Jen and I were talking about, needing to or wanting, right, to put a show together that really dealt with the human body, I was like, well, how could we sort of unearth, this history, that we actually are still navigating right now?
We talked a lot about how the figure sculpture in public sculpture representing Confederate generals and certainly during the Black Lives Matter movement, but before that, and hopefully going forward, are being questioned, pulled down, reinterpreted. And we talked about how the figure has been something that's been explored in ceramic and clay. In fact, from way before that period of time when it ends up as a bronze cast, right? So you go back all the way to the Venus of Willendorf and those early figures where people are just trying to represent themselves. So we had this situation where we could talk both about how do we make new and exhibit these new amazing artists who are doing figure sculpture that is the real story, that's going against all these things that Kelli has said, like these fictive narratives of white male power that doesn't really exist. It's just what is presented in order to oppress, and combining it with these wonderful young artists, or not all young, but these wonderful artists who are exploring all of the social, political lenses that are part of our discourse at this moment, and actually going back before those fictive narratives were presented, and kind of combining those two things to present a new vision of the human figure in clay.
Yeah, and a lot of this fiction of the white male power, it goes back to mythology. But I think in mythology, you can see that that's not real. Like Hercules, there's no idea that like Hercules was like an individual. But when you look at, let's say, Robert E. Lee on a horse in Richmond, the idea is this monument was like, not only is this real, but it's important because it's scale. So these monuments, the bigger, this is kind of a simplification, but the bigger the figure, the more important it is. And you see these monuments from political figures, from all these different things. But I know as a curator, Jennifer, you were thinking about scale. That's something we talked about in our pre-interview, is the scale of a ceramic figure and how the human body meets that scale when you enter the gallery. So can you talk a little bit about the parameters that you set for the artists setting up this show?
Yeah, so that's another thing that Kelli and I really talked about, is we have all these choices, right? There are all these amazing artists making work. We needed parameters as curators, and the idea, I like the way you said that we don't want something necessarily that's twice the size of human. We don't want something that's small. We wanted people to walk into the gallery and be eye to eye with the sculptures, to feel that we are in community with the artists, with their sculptures, with the ideas that they're representing. And I would love for Kelli to talk more about that.
Sure. It was more like, we wanted people to have a human experience, with objects that look like them. We talk a lot in the field right now, right, about representation and, being able to go into an art museum and see yourself represented. And so Jen and I were like, well, what if, we actually, commission artists or ask, the artists that we're thinking about to create works that don't just like represent people, right, or simply like represent people, but also are like confrontational. But not in necessarily a negative way, right? But are
engaging.
Yeah, that I was gonna say, like the figures that people can meet on like their own terms, as if you're almost talking to someone or interacting or moving around, right? between yeah, like subjects, that you understand, right? And that so that visitors movement, actually kind of actually activate, the objects in a particular way. It's like, what would that look like? With clay sculpture or clay figures, right? Then we talked about that too, like the difference between like how it's sculpture when it's like bronze, marble, and other medium. But when we talk about clay, we don't automatically say sculpture. So just kind of also trying to break down that hierarchy, right, between craft and fine art and sculpture and clay, right, in making or asking, right, the artist to create works that would do that would trouble, right, that water, or would trouble that binary.
Yeah, I think in the essay you all described it as that clay is democratic. That clay as a material is from the earth and we are from the earth. Like the separation of material is not there with, say, bronze, which is a heavily manipulated material in terms of heat work and all of that. And even marble. I mean, marble cost-wise is so expensive that it has this idea of eliteness. So can you all talk more about that, about the sort of inherent democracy of clay?
Often Kelli and I and kind of the Clay Studios exhibition program mission, in a way, we often end up using these phrases: clay is of the earth, we are of the earth, clay can unify us. And that inherent in the material is the powerful message that is very connected to what we want our message to be, which is we want everyone to come in the door. It's free to come and see art at the Clay Studio. We work hard to engage with our hyper-local community. As you know, we just moved our building. So we were in Old City, Philadelphia for 48 years, and now we're in South Kensington. And I was very excited and lucky to have Kelli as part of our programming for the exhibition series. When we started here in South Kensington, we worked together on Making Place Matter, which was an extension and an amplification of our work to make sure that the community in this area know us, that we engendered a sense of them having agency at the Clay Studio, that they were part of the process. So we asked the council, after work, to build trust with the community. We asked whoever wanted within these groups we were working with to join our council, and they helped us with designing the exhibition, that first exhibition, Making Place Matter, in the building. And that we want to continue that work to make sure that we present exhibitions that are relevant, that are representative, as Kelli said, that allow as many people as possible who walk in the door to have a meaningful experience. And then that has to be that there is some reflection of themselves in the gallery.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think everybody knows clay, whether you kind of like, whether you're a ceramicist or not, whether it's like, planting pots outside, on your porch, or just kind of like the sedentary, like clay kind of mud that's left over after like a really hard rain. I can think of times as a kid with like a stick, like writing my name in the, in the mud. Or sometimes where you go to particular beaches, right? And if you dig deep enough in the sand, it's a different consistency. I think there's something about clay that there are very different inroads to it, in very different ways to relate to it. I think it's like how malleable, it is, says a lot too, in terms of, what we can make it into, whether it is human-sized sculptures or, gigantic sculptures or little miniatures, or functional objects like cups and saucers and bowls, which the Clay Studio, right, has a beautiful gallery, right? Just there's always, really wonderful works, for sale that you can take home, just to make your morning coffee, with like that kind of relationship. I don't necessarily think we always think about that. Like we're in TJ Maxx or Target and you're like, ugh, right? You're not necessarily like, oh, clay. But I do think there's like clay exists, like beyond the art space, right, in our lives in a natural way, in a functional way, and not just this exhibition, but I think the Clay Studios overall exhibitionary, that's not a word, but anyway. But I think the Clay Studios approach, to presenting clay to their overall community, like really allows people, whatever their access point is to the medium, or to art is, it's just not something you see, every day in art institutions.
Well, yeah, I wanted to dive deeper into that because what you're talking about is accessibility. And I think the venue itself determines some of that. So I was thinking about how architecture, in our previous conversation about the figure as an imperial force, architecture is a huge part of that. So when you look at architecture in D.C., I just went to D.C., the political buildings and the art museums look similar. And it's about power. It's about political power. But when you walk into the Clay Studio, the architecture is a modernist design. It does not have that same feeling of unapproachability. It's the opposite. It's like you're walking in off the street, you take a left, there's the show. There's no big grand stairway. It is all about the people experiencing that. So do you guys have any thoughts on accessibility in venue? Like how do you set up a venue so that literally someone off the street can come in and see that as opposed to walking through the hallowed halls of a major museum?
Thank you for saying that. We talked a lot about that as the building was being designed. Jennifer Martin and our executive director and Josie Bockelman, our deputy director, worked really closely with the architects to make sure that there were both welcoming entrances, that there are moments throughout the building where you interact. So that definitely happens in the shop and gallery on the first floor and in our demo studio on the first floor, which is a new thing for us to have a space of where people make things right in the front window. So anyone who walks by understands this is a place where we make things. That is not something we had in the old space. It's not so obvious to visitors, but the Claymobile has a parking spot inside a covered area, and it goes directly into their studio. So that means that the very important outreach community engagement work that we do through the Claymobile is physically supported by the architecture, because the teachers don't have to find a parking spot, go up the ramp, use an elevator. So we made sure that that was really integral into that first floor. And then upstairs in the studios, there are lots of touch points for different groups of artists to interact with each other. The glaze room, the central area where the sinks and the slab rollers are. So that was definitely an important part of the conversation. And then we knew that we needed, although we've done community engagement for a long time, we knew that we needed to increase and work harder and do more research and figure out ways to better engage and more fully engage with the community. So we needed our programming to match that architecture effort. And because the gallery is in a way the most democratic space, so this might be a point of conversation, because we often think of art galleries as elitist spaces, but in fact the gallery is free. You're not really being tempted to try to buy something necessarily, because you're looking at art, you're thinking, you're reading the labels, you're being asked really just to have like your own moment of contemplation. So we wanted to make sure that people felt welcome. So we asked different people with different expertises, and that those people included the most important, next door neighbors. I know how to walk into a gallery space and feel welcome. I'm an art historian. Like that's what I love. And, I've been doing it for a long time, but I don't know how our next door neighbors here in South Kensington would feel most welcome. So we asked them. They're the experts. We asked other people in museum spaces. We asked Kelli Morgan to help us think about that. And those are, to me, asking for help and asking for other people's opinions is a big part of it. We also, deeper into the exhibition process, to me, that means I can't be a curator. It's not relevant for me to be a sole voice as a curator. I think it's really important that whenever there's a major kind of thought forward exhibition, that there should be a co-curator, at least one co-curator, that the exhibition council needs to be very involved with the design of the gallery space and the programs to make sure people feel welcome. Again, I want to value everyone's expertise. That doesn't mean that I don't think that my expertise is valuable, but I know that I need Dr. Kelli Morgan to be my partner for this exhibition, and to honor her expertise, and then to honor those council people as equal partners as well.
Kelli, can you talk about how you came to the list as co-curators? How did you guys come to the list of 12? I think it's 12. So how did you formulate that?
Honestly, I was like, Google, like
Instagram.
Yep, very literally. We knew we wanted, artists who were working with full scale figures. And, it literally was like scrolling through our Instagram feeds and looking at other people's pages, looking at the artists that we knew, and like who they were connected to, and other artists that had popularity, just national popularity. And then I think other artists who were also kind of familiar, in the clay studio atmosphere, right? Or the clay studio community, that they hadn't, that the institution hadn't necessarily, right, engaged in an exhibition way.
Some of the artists that were in this show have a very direct process of making the sculpture. So let's think about Roberto Lugo's piece is a life cast. So when you're looking at that piece, it's like you're looking at him in the eyes. And then there's other figures like Christina West's figure. The sculpture is more gestural, but also it's fragmented. Like you're not getting the full body. It's actually, I think, probably the least amount of form you can have and still have the body in your mind. And I think that is very different in process, but there's some difference in content there. So did y'all think about that process as content? And do you have any thoughts about those two pieces?
Yeah, Roberto's piece is actually different. Now he's actually submitting a work that's like a large teddy bear. That is a ode to street memorials, right? So the way in which, again, young Black and brown, men and women are often killed, whether it's, homicide or car accidents or, just whatever, police violence, whatever. And it's really a tradition across, urban communities, across the country, to do these street murals. Or street memorial, sorry. And oftentimes there's a big teddy bear, or maybe multiple. And so he's doing a big teddy bear, for the show that's going to be surrounded by like a kind of encircled by smaller ones. So I'm actually really excited about that because at first I was like, a teddy bear? I was like, okay, where are we going with this? And then I was like, oh no. And it was fascinating because as soon as he showed me the sketches, and I met with him last Friday, and going back to what one recognizes, right? Or seeing oneself, it's like as soon as he said, yeah, this is a street memorial, I knew immediately, and it was I could recognize my community and other communities that I've lived in, over my life. And I was like, I know exactly what that is. And I know exactly why that's important. So that was it was a really great conversation. Christina's work is really cool because she's actually fracturing, right, that history of Greek classical sculpture, fracturing it literally, like you said, in the kind of spaces that are missing, but then also fracturing it and leaving her handprint, in the medium itself, right? So you actually can like see, like she doesn't smooth it out at all. She also glazes the work in this really kind of ruddy, like pink flesh tone, to give you a sense of an actual human body, but while also like forcing us, to fill in the gaps of what we bring to classical sculpture.
I think it's a really good point to think about that surprise that Kelli was talking about, and like the discovery when we talk to the artists. Many of them have come back with not exactly what we were and had in our minds as curators. And that's such a gift. And it is one of the most exciting things about curating shows with artists when you're really partnering with the artists. We talk about partnering with the community. We're also partnering with the artists, obviously, in this conversation. And we are human. So when we have an idea and someone comes back with something different, it's like, but then we get to learn and think more deeply and really appreciate all these different approaches that people are representing, and isn't that exactly what we wanted, but a great variety, because that is what we're trying to represent, that our society contains multitudes.
And I also add, just to like one more thing, is that the fact that, the artist knew and felt that they had that agency and autonomy to change it. That they didn't have to just abide by, right, our curatorial vision, or, what we had sort of sent to them as like a guide of what we were thinking. That their interpretations, and as those interpretations changed, were able to, and allowed to, so that kind of freedom of flow, of artistic creativity, and like creative thinking, is the point, basically.
And I think, to give a musical analogy, this is jazz, not classical. Like you're asking the players to be a part of this because you like the way they play, not like classical where the piece is written in the 1800s and then they got to play it exactly the way, that you've said.
It's a privilege again to be working with these artists, and Kelli, of course. The way the Clay Studio has in the past been able to do exhibitions because of our, modest budgets and things like that, we don't often get a chance to have these touch points with the artists. So the fact that we have oftentimes twice been able to engage with the artists through these Zoom studio visits that we're doing is such a privilege. And, my favorite part of my job, for sure. Again, not being the sole curatorial voice is so, I want to use the word freeing because it's like, you have the fact that we have two different perspectives also, I think, puts the artists at ease a bit. And, we have more capacity to really get what's happening between the two of us. And, we also are really lucky to have the support of a few grants. We have a National Endowment for the Arts grant for this exhibition, and some other. The Ruth Foundation also just recently gave us some exhibition funds in order to make all of this easier, because part of equity, part of working together with the artists, is being able to pay them for their time, or at the very least pay for the shipping. And I know this is a joke between us, because whenever we're talking, I'm like, how heavy is that? What are the dimensions? Do you have someone who can build your crate? But it's really important that artists are not asked to do something and then not given the resources that they need. When we've been talking about this show, Kelli, for 2 years.
Years.
Right? Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, the shipping was not quite as expensive as it is now. And even at that time, we knew that we needed the artists to have the freedom to be able to make whatever they wanted to make, and then know that they didn't have to pay for those costs. So I just think it's important to kind of acknowledge the practicalities of it too, but that the practicalities affect equity.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is about how do you set up the artist to succeed? Because like think about how many times artists are almost set up to fail, or at least they got a couple shots against them going into shipping costs, going into, let's say they're a West Coast sculptor and they have to, I mean, they're shipping, but then there's also like, how do you make something in your studio and physically deal with it in your space? And I think about George Rodriguez is like, is so good at this. Like I've seen him work in different environments and he has this ability to make large scale things in component parts so that they can all fit in different ways. But I wanted to talk more about the specific artist, he being one of them. Who else is in the show? And can you talk a little bit about the thought process of including them?
Yeah, the one thing you talking about the components reminds me of Christina Cordova's work, and talking when we talked to Christina, her work is also like really great. And when she was walking us through, Ben, like how it came apart and like, or where, she was planning, right, for it to come apart. And it was this rod that was going to go through this one place. And for me, and I mean, and maybe it was like my own naivete, but I was fascinated because I was like, man, to a large degree, artists have to be engineers, so it's like they really have to know like the math of like how something fits, comes apart and fits together. And again, in my own mind, I was like, oh yeah, I never could have been an artist. I was like, the math, just like me going, like my original plan was to like go to medical school. And I was like, the math just got me. I was like, nope. Like, yeah. I was like, oh, there's no way. And I can think of like just listening to her in that moment. And it was just so seamless, just as smooth as the clay, like on the surface of the actual sculpture. And she was just like, oh yeah, no problem. I'm going to do this, and this is going to happen. And I was like, yeah, no, like, I don't have that skill set, and it was really great. Or like, Jonathan's work, and like the conversation about like building the crate, for his piece, because his work isn't just fully ceramic. Like the actual bodies of the work is cloth. And I've always had this sense as a curator of like, artists are so phenomenal because they're making things that don't exist. And just coming up with, or, in these conversations, coming to understanding the mathematics, in the engineering of it, and having to think about that simultaneously, with just the creative part of it. It's like people have no idea what goes into an artist's process, of making a work.
Absolutely. So many of these are components. It's like, how can you cut it up to get it into the kiln? Chris Rogers is a resident artist here at the Clay Studio. So he's making it here. So we don't have to pay for shipping. Yay. But he had to make it in 2 parts so that it could fit into the kilns, even with our new bigger kilns. And he's making a version of the Laocoon. So like Christina West, kind of thinking about classical sculpture. And that piece was so important to the birth of the Renaissance. When it was rediscovered in Rome, Michelangelo supposedly was there on site when they uncovered it. And it had an incredible impact on what came after it. And so Chris has always wanted to engage with it, but he's done it in a way to try to make it relevant for today. He's distorting the piece physically, and he's really thinking about all the different layers of the meanings of what the actual mythological story of Laocoon meant, how there are various versions of it, and then how it had this impact on the Renaissance. And then what does it mean today as we are thinking about our, social justice and other issues in our certainly art world and in our world at large. As you mentioned, George Rodriguez is thinking, he's also making it here at the Clay Studio, which is great, but it had to be made into separate parts. And we are very lucky that we have amazing studio technicians who have been helping, because George, he's not always been able to be on site. And Chris Rogers as well. So it's a team effort. And so that's another great thing about clay, is that we are here in community and we're all working together to make sure that physically that these pieces are finished. But George's figure is just covered with sprigs that represent patterns referencing ancient Central American cultures and different mythological figures from his culture. So the fact that mythology is represented from many different perspectives is also really cool. Who else is on your mind, Kelly, that you want to talk about?
I wanted to go back to Jonathan really quick too, about his representation of history, and the name of the work is Seeds of Tomorrow, right? And it's about like Mexican railroad workers and families who moved to Lawrence, Kansas, which is where he's located now, to work on the Santa Fe Railroad, right? And the way that they had to provide for themselves. There's representation of, food and how they grew their own food and, issues of food insecurity. And he too, has, like, I hate pre-Columbian, but that's the term, but pre-Columbian mythology, or pre-Columbian, like, deities, are also represented, in the work, is important to him, as, a Latinx, artist, Young Men, in her work, which is really cool. It's I hate to say, like, it's comical, but because it's not technically, but it kind of is.
It's trippy. It's psychedelic in the way that those heads blend together.
It really is. And, it totally is a commentary on COVID, in the way that, it did kind of melt, like just kind of melt us all, into this, like, society just kind of turned it into this kind of blob of what we knew it to be. That we're in the midst, right, of reshaping right now. But it also, like you said, it has this kind of psychedelic kind of, also kind of comical, kind of fun but scary sense to it. Just in how brightly colored, in terms of the glazes that she used, in terms of the facial expressions, of the figures themselves, or the heads themselves, to where, because I know that was definitely an issue that I struggled with, during quarantine, where, I was in a situation that was like so ridiculously depressing and oppressive. So quarantine was like a godsend for me, where for majority of the world, right, it was devastating. It was fatal, and I like her, like when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, it was like that spoke to my whole life, during that time period. So there's that. And I think about Tip's work, Jen, and like the softness of, a child at play, particularly a little girl. There's the works, they just span, a lot of the human experience, across age, right? Like despite race, class, like all those things. But it's also not like doing that whole, like the universal human experience, right?
We have the clay. The clay
right.
adds that, and then all these specifics. Yeah, that's so great.
Well, I'm glad you said the universal human experience. You could almost play a game to go into exhibitions and see if you can find those words on the curatorial statement, because it is prevalent. And I don't think anybody's actually said this explicitly, but the show is also about personal identity. Like each of these sculptors is chosen because they use the figure to talk about their own personal identity. So what are your thoughts on personal identity in the modern era? Because let's say you look back at the 50s or 60s or 70s, like every decade has a different perspective of personal identity. And at this point, it feels like that people, especially artists, feel empowered to talk about personal identity through work. That has not always been that way. So do you guys have thoughts about that at the present moment?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very much so like a Black feminist sentiment, something that's very specific, to Black feminist theory. Myself as a Black woman, I really hold dear, Patricia Hill Collins, theory of using like personal and cultural biography as a valid mode of knowledge production, right? And a valid mode of existence. And some of it, came through like my own experiences, right? Being in predominantly white, right, traditional institutions. And I was like, none of this makes, not that it doesn't make sense to me, but I was like, the way this is happening, right, is like not okay. So I had to use a different frame of reference. And that frame of reference became Detroit and my mother, right, and my grandparents and like that kind of thing. I think we're, in the age of social media, where identity is so, I think, problematically constructed, very literally constructed. I see, at least from a lot of artists, like a pushback, to that, in both realms. So it's like here, my identity is not a bad thing. It is a form of knowledge for me. And also pushing back, against like the AI, social media, like construct of you can just build this virtual self that doesn't actually exist, at least in Black communities. It seems to be very pertinent, right, and like really important right now, that we show up in the world, as our authentic selves, because the world has never necessarily let us do that. So when you are a person that's pushing back against centuries of stereotypes, that becomes a thing. But this whole like, dedication or like commitment, to being one's authentic self, in the midst of such constructed identity, I think is really important. And I think a lot of the artists, in this show are doing that.
That is one of the most important values of art. I also, from the beginning of my interest in art history, it's always been very focused on personal spaces and personal objects. So I was interested in fashion and architecture, and then I learned that there was a thing called decorative arts about objects that we use in our everyday lives, and then contemporary craft. And I've always felt really drawn to things that are made with the traditional craft materials. The reference to function is always really interesting to me. I think that when we look back, as starting out as a historian and then an art historian, I was just fascinated by the fact that I could look at a chair from 1876 and learn about the identity and the moral, the ethical concerns, the social issues around the woman who sat in that chair just by looking at it. It's smaller, so it must be for a woman. It's low, it doesn't have arms because her skirt had to be, spilling around because she had to wear this kind of clothing because she was expected to be this certain way. So to me, craft in general has always been imbued with more ways to examine self-identity, to identity, which brings us to the human condition in a way, because that's how I connect. It's like I can imagine, I can empathize with those people from other times, from other cultures, through the things that we have in common. Craft is also powerful in that way because it's, as you said before with clay, it's more democratic. People have easier access to these things than to, painting and sculpture as a way of self-expression. Women's work, embroidery, knitting, seamstresses, the people who make things that they need to make to survive, then make the more creative versions of those things for their self-expression is another feeling for me of democratization of these materials and how we can examine what we all have in common and celebrate that there are differences between us at the same time. So that feeling of empathy is at the core of what I hope that people feel when they come into really any exhibition at the Clay Studio, but this one in particular, this idea that you're going to be face to face with another representation of another human, and it's going to be presented to you in a way that's showing what that artist thinks is important. I hope that each visitor will learn. They'll want to see what these decorations on George Rodriguez's sculptures are and understand his culture better so that they can empathize further. So I think I've come full circle back to saying, yes, it is about the universal human experience. I'm sorry, but that's why I'm a curator.
Yeah, and before when I said that, I don't mean to poke fun. I think sometimes that it's hard to put into language something that feels so profoundly personal. And so we talk about the human experience to describe that. But I think with figure sculpture, you don't need language. Like what I like about this show in particular is you walk in and you see those and you look them in the eye, you're going to relate to it in that way. It's a bodily sensation that then goes to the mind, which I think is an interesting thing. But I wanted to wrap up the interview talking about the Clay Studio in general and actually reference the Making Place Matter Symposium. Kelli, you were the last speaker and you were getting ready to give a talk that you had written, and you actually said, I'm not going to give the talk I've written. I'm just going to talk about what my experience has been at the Clay Studio working with you all. And I wanted to just ask you, one of the things you said is this is an organization that's doing it the right way in terms of meeting with community members, being a part of the community, being a gentrifying force in the community, but also doing it in a culturally responsible way. So I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about your thoughts about working with the Clay Studio on the bigger project of being a member of the Philadelphia and South Kensington communities.
Oh yeah, I mean that was it's 2022 now, so that's been like a 6-year, or like a 5-year journey. Ben, and it honestly started with Jen and I meeting for coffee, like our first, actually like meeting one another, and and her saying, we're moving to South Kensington and we cannot mess this up. Right. And me saying, yeah, no, you really can't, because that'd be super bad. And just over the years of just us having conversations, and there was another really important one. And that might have been fall of 2017. And I think it was, and I had brought my craft seminar class. And just, hearing Jen kind of walk them through, like, here are all the ways, that an institution can do this poorly. So what we've been doing, right, is going to community organizations and community groups and just listening, or going to, community meetings and just saying, we're here. We want to know what you're doing, like how we can participate in it, how we can share our resources, like, what do you need? Asking the community that question, letting the community be skeptical, in those first, those first few meetings, and showing up like as themselves, not necessarily saying like, here I am as the Clay Studio, but here I am as mother, friend, future neighbor, Jennifer Zwilling or Jennifer Martin, right? Coming as individuals. And during the Making Place Matter Symposium, it was great to hear, the community council members, on their panel say, like on that like how they moved, through going from, oh, what is this gonna be? Oh, we don't necessarily know, right? To like, oh, they're serious. Okay, well, you know what? I'm gonna go to this meeting, or I'm gonna go to this like art making activity. I'm gonna show up to this other thing, and then literally like feeling comfortable to like let their guards down, to say, oh no, they're serious. They're actually like paying us to be here as well. Like, we're getting a small honorarium to be here. They're respecting the fact that I want to bring my mother, or I need to bring my dog, or that kind of thing. They're aware, of who, someone like Kekuli Velarde, and like her, history and importance, to the community, not just as an artist, but again, as a mother, as a neighbor, as a community member. And it was just witnessing that as somebody who was working as like an outside, like kind of contractor, like I was an evaluator on the project, but being able to see that, up close and personal, to see that actually COVID and quarantine didn't slow the Clay Studios efforts down, with that either. It was just watching them kind of bringing it together in such a magical way. That relationship and that community connection like maintained itself, in a virtual space. And I was like, oh my God. So for me, it was like, this can actually happen. Like this can actually work. And really and truly, even beyond funding, Ben, it was like, all that's necessary is the willingness to do it. Mm-hmm. Because you hear so many art institutions, it's like, oh, it's too much. And oh, we don't have a bandwidth. And oh, we need a grant, all of the things. And it was watching, Jennifer and her colleagues, just say, no, we're going to do this like this because we want to, and it's important. And not only is it important to us, it's important to all the people, who have been in this community for decades before we got here. Right. So like she was saying, like they were the experts. And it was like, we are going to do and be here in the way that they want us to be, in the way that they need us to be. Not in the way that, we kind of want to like fly our new building flag. And I felt like that was just phenomenal because I've been talking about this stuff, curatorially, 2 to 5 years, but to be able to actually like see it like happen and then continue was just like, I was over the moon. Like our last like Making Place Matter council meeting, and we were writing the didactics, and I was just like, community members were like, clearly you are excited, Kelli. Because I kept saying, I'm so excited. Oh my God, it's like, it's actually working. And I think it was like Melissa who was like, we know that you are excited. Clearly you are excited. And Miss Alice, it was so funny. She was just like, yes, baby, we got it. Right. But I was, because I was like, you get the excuses, from institutions so much, and it was just, so and during the symposium, I wanted to really express, like to drive that home for people, that this was not just something that the Clay Studio is saying, or that these council members are just saying because they're on the council. This is something that I was able to, not just me, right, but everybody who was involved, were able to observe, and that there's space for other people to participate when they want to, and you should want to, because it's exciting.
And it makes everything better. I was so surprised and honored when we had that in 2017 and your class came to visit, and then we talked more. I was just felt comfortable right away with Kelli and was just telling her all the things we're thinking about. I wasn't pitching to her, we were just talking. And the fact that she came back to me and was like, what you're doing is actually really great, and that you're like thinking about things and actually putting into action stuff that other people are not doing. Because internally, we're like, we are often saying we're not doing enough. How can we do more? That is really, truly the conversation that we have. So to have the reflection back and the feedback that you are on the right track was so important, just to keep our energy and morale. So Kelli, I hope I've said thank you before, but I need to keep thanking you for that because it was really meaningful. It also, all this good feedback that we got from the council means we are happy and that we're on the right track, but that we have to keep working. Like they literally said to us, you have gained our trust. We better keep their trust, so it's energizing in order to keep doing the work, which is, I think, really important because we want to work together. We want to be truly establishing new ways to think about art and think about how art organizations can be in their communities in general. But we also want specifically the Clay Studio to be having good relationships with these specific people that we have gained great relationships and trust with, and moved beyond being, uh-oh, here come the garden variety white ladies. Maybe don't put that in the podcast. No, I don't know. That's what Melissa said at the, but she was like, but then they proved that they were really, that they cared. And anyway.
I use it as an example in my trainings now, whenever people ask, because I get asked all the time, what institution is doing it correctly? And I'm always like, the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. Like, here's a catalog, right? Like, go on the website, watch the videos. I'm constantly like sending students, curators, directors that I talk to, to that, to those materials, to say, like, there's an example out there, because that's another excuse you get from the bigger institutions too. Like, oh, there's no model, right? Like, there's no map, there's no framework. And I'm just like, no, that's actually not true. And it was like, it's going, right? It's active, and it was pretty recent.
And we needed help, from Kelli, and she had created this amazing framework that she used to engage that label writing for the last meeting that she was talking about, which, I couldn't have done that. That's another part of the model, is just ask for help, figure out who the people are who need to be sitting at the table with you. And we were just so lucky that Kelli wanted to help and felt that what we were doing was valuable. So
me too. It was fascinating to see, not just the label writing exercise, but even just the pre-community, trust building, right, frameworks, or interest, because there were so many. I had been doing that work by myself, for 3 years, just on my own. So it was kind of cool to see, Jen and her Clay Studio colleagues, like, do that. Like, it kind of come together in these pieces, right? Which, because even the label writing framework I learned from my colleagues at Newfields, some of the issues that we were running up against, and we used to call ourselves the machine, right? We worked as a collective. Everybody knows what happened with that situation, but it was like even now it's like hard for me to even express it, because it was just being able to see that it works, that it actually does work, if you're really dedicated, and you're committed to it. So I was honored myself, just to be asked and just to be a part of it, because I'm like, I have been struggling with this, like fighting real live battles, with institutions trying to do this. So I was just like, it was just wonderful, to see it from the ground up. And then the other cherry on top for me is like the year that I was a reviewer at Pew was the year that Clay Studio applied, right, for the Pew grant that got them. And I had to recuse myself from that deliberation. But that was another moment where I was just like, oh my God, I've been kind of somewhere in the mix with this, this whole time. So it's fascinating to watch it go from a conversation over a coffee, to a real live brick and mortar, community love thing today. It's just it's I just can't even.
Well, and it's important to note that we did get funding. So although that shouldn't be an excuse, we did have a major grant from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, which was a huge reason why we could do it as well as we did, that we could pay the help that we needed. We were able to hire a community organizer. We were able to hire a project coordinator for the whole project. And that was really the third grant, because we were thinking about this work for a long time. So we had a smaller grant from Pew and a smaller grant from William Penn when we were just early testing phases. And that, I think it's really important to make sure I say out loud, Josie Bockelman, who was the school manager at the time and in charge of Claymobile and everything. The reason why this really is working at the Clay Studio is because the exhibition artistic, the curator, myself, and the education person, the Claymobile person, Josie, community outreach, community engagement, we work together from the beginning, because this is not just about exhibitions. It's about community engagement and exhibitions. And, again, teamwork and having the right expertise and just all being willing to work really hard. Maria Albornez got a great shout out at the symposium because she just did such a great job. She was the community organizer. She speaks Spanish. She, drove during COVID. She drove people their clay kits at their homes so they could do them during the project. So I just want to make sure and Ana Jimenez, the project coordinator, I think it's important to say everybody's name. Because it doesn't happen without all that help.
Well, to wrap up, can you plug the symposium that will happen that coincides with this exhibition?
Yes, I hope everyone will join us. So the opening reception is January 12th, which is a Thursday. We're going to have a workshop with Jonathan Christensen Caballero and Sergei Isipov on Friday afternoon, the 13th. And then Saturday, the 14th, will be from 9:30 to 3:30. We're going to hear from all of the 12 artists, Dr. Kelli Morgan, myself a bit. We're going to have the curator of ceramics and glass from Winter Tour there, Leslie Grigsby. She's going to talk about a historical example because Kelli and I are both historians. We like to make sure that's added in there. And again, just adding more partnerships is always important. So we're going to have a lot of the artists coming in from all around the country. It's going to be really exciting. You can join either hybrid or in person. The symposium is totally free. We just want people to register, and you can go to our website and go to the exhibition page for Figuring Space and click to register there.
Well, I look forward to that. And I appreciate you both taking the time to do this today.
Thank you, Ben.
Appreciate the attention.
I'd like to thank Jennifer and Kelli for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with them, and I'm looking forward to going to the symposium and seeing all this work in person. I forgot to mention at the top of the show that there is going to be a workshop featuring Sergei Isipov and Jonathan Christensen Caballero. That's going to be happening Friday, January the 13th from 1 to 4 p.m. at the Clay Studio. They are asking that you register for the workshop and the symposium, and you can do that by searching for Figuring Space at theclaystudio.org. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors. That is the Archie Bray Foundation and Amico Brent. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on this show or any of the other ones on the Brickyard Network, you can get in touch through the website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.